I'm a genie in a bottle, baby. Is that some sort of song? Is that a song? Is that a
It is.
Jamiroquai song or something?
It's not
I
Jamiroquai.
don't fucking know who it
It's,
is, but I know
it's
it's a song
Christina
in it.
Aguilera.
Is it Christina Aguilera, is it?
Yeah.
Is she the
Which is
one that
why I'm
did the
glad you
dirty
haven't gone
one?
for Farm Boy
Is she
Karaoke.
the one that does the
Yeah.
stripper music?
Yeah. Back
Right,
in the day, she did. She's all
okay.
posh now.
Is she posh now, is she?
Yeah, she does classy shit.
Okay. This is the No Holds Barred Witchcraft podcast. If you have never listened to us before, then expect a lot like what you've just heard, basically. But then also weaved in and out a little bit of the magical talk as well. So obviously on the Thoth Witchcraft Patreon, people get the opportunity to name the episodes. And this was an episode request. So we didn't come up with the name. The person requested the name of this podcast episode, which is Genie in a Bottle Baby, but they didn't tell us what they wanted it to be about, so we're going to go all sorts of places with this. So it'll be mad ramblings about a genies and a gin and a stuff like that. So there's a couple of things that I think we need to discuss, Chris. I think the first and foremost, we've got to talk about bottling up spirits. And then we've got to talk about the ethics of that. And then how you might go about doing that. And then I'm wondering if we should talk about a gin as well. Not the gin with, rhubarb, the ones you drink, but the gin is in the type of spirit like.
Yeah, it sounds good to me.
Okay, so bottling up a spirit. I think there can sometimes be some confusion every now and then. Because some people, what they'll say, and this is normally the paranormal investigatory types, so some people will often say, bottling up a spirit is not really binding it. It's not like putting it in a prison. You're just kind of giving it kind of like an anchor to stay somewhere. So there's lots of different kinds of ideas, I think, for bottling up spirits. So we know a certain someone that's on the Thoth Patreon, which I think they use it more like a prison, like my prison book. So
Yeah.
like Alcatraz, some next level Alcatraz shit.
Alcatraz.
When they finish with their Dolmio pasta jars, they think I know what to do with this. I think I might use it as the spirit version of Alcatraz, right? But then there's other people that think, oh well, spirits give them a vessel type thing. I haven't got a vessel, so we'll put them in a jar. And I kind of understand that, but I kind of have the idea as, I don't know if it's because I grew up with all this Disney stuff about, genies in lamps and that kind of thing. Rub the genie and then it grants you a wish, and that kind of is a Solomonic kind of Abrahamic approach to ceremonial magic where you buying them to some brass shit and then they have to do whatever you want.
Yeah.
That's where my mind goes with regards to this. So can we clear up a few things in regards to what we would talk about if we were ever to mention genies and ever to mention spirits in jars and stuff? Because I know you've threatened a few people about putting their soul in a jar, I think, haven't you?
I've threatened people all sorts. You'll have to be a bit more specific. But but yeah, it's one of those things of when you're considering it, it's you need to know exactly what you want to do with it. So our friend on the Patreon, he definitely likes prisons. Um, but obviously that had to require a very specific way of doing that, and actually the jar itself has nothing to do with being a prison. Um, so it's actually not even part of the spell really. It's an aesthetic thing, rather than necessarily, So he's actually imprisoning them in something different. But the bottle was part of a kind of elemental thing, so it was the earth part of the connection. So it kind of worked on those bases. So actually, it was more, you could smash the bottle and it'd still be in the prison, is what I'm saying. Whereas most people would think, oh, if you destroy the vessel, then suddenly it's free and ready to roam again. Obviously, with most of these jars, and other kinds of vessels that are used to trap spirits of various different kinds, actually the only important part is the seal. So in what way, shape or form you have actually created said seal will depend on whether or not it's a vessel as an anchor or a vessel as a prison. So if we're sticking with those two stereotypes rather than confuse everybody, but if we start with those two kind of stereotypes of either being a vessel or an anchor, I think those are good ones to go with. Any
Okay, so
preference
with the
which one?
anchor, that could be any physical object, couldn't it? So I think
Yeah,
anchors we'd probably talk about on a separate podcast because there's a lot of ways you can go with that, and I think the life after death thing, and then mummification, and then all these sorts of things will be interesting to talk about in terms of anchors. So let's talk about the genie in the bottle perspective of binding a spirit in the form of a contract, because that's the idea of kind of the genie, I think, is that you've got a spirit, and by some sort of law, even in the Disney one, I think the genie didn't have free will, did it? So it was essentially
no,
imprisoned in the
it's a
lamp.
prisoner.
Yeah. And then there's obviously actions, so whereby rubbing the lamp would grant you free wishes, so the genie would work for you 3 times, that kind of thing. So that's kind of a spirit banged. And then obviously if you're binding it to something, there's the idea of the Divok box, of course.
Yeah,
And then there's the
yeah,
idea of the lamp, or jars often, because witches is often poor, so they haven't got all these fancy boxes lying around. Unless you're lazy Lady Poison, because she likes to collect pretty boxes like I do. A lot of witches do like to do that, but the poor witches can just collect just the jars because they can't afford the fancy boxes. They ain't got nowhere to put them. So the jar, in terms of the stereotype of putting a spirit in a jar. Now, when you put a spirit in a jar, and that's some sort of binding or a prison for it, obviously we could talk about approaches that you could take with that, but from that perspective, is the jar important? So if you broke and smashed the jar, would that release it from its contract? Does the size of the jar matter? If I've got a big spirit, can I put that in one of those mini little vodka bottles, that Nanny and all that they put in their handbags when they're going out anywhere because they're raging alcoholics? Or does it need to be like a big bottle, like my Kraken gin, like my Kraken bottle, my Kraken rum bottle that I take to go and collect the spring water from? That's a big bottle. That's like a litre. If I got a little measly crappy little elemental spirit, do I have to put that in a little bottle? Will it fit in a big bottle? If I put an archangel, would I have to use a bigger bottle for that? Or am I just being a bit pedantic?
you're being
Because
pedantic.
that's what the beginners ask. You go on the forums, they will ask
Yeah,
you, does the size of the bottle matter? Does it matter what sort of jar it is?
no,
All that sort of
no,
thing.
because of course not, because it's a binding spell. So all you're doing is fixing it again. It's part of this anchor part, but not. So you're just fixing it and restricting its energy. So at that point you're talking about something that is spirit. So the physical side, you're only dealing with the physical representation. You're not dealing with what the actual magic is, which is obviously um, a binding and a prison that actually exists on an astral or some other spiritual level rather than in the physical plane. So the physical plane part is just the anchor to the spell. It's the physical representation that's used in order to make that happen. Hence why if you smash the bottle, it's not necessarily going to release them because that's not normally what they're anchored to.
So obviously, from the perspective of the witch that wanted to go away and do this, they could, if they wanted to, use that bottle or jar as a kind of physical anchor, and that if the jar was to break or anyone was to open the jar, that would release the spirit. But at the same time, you're saying a more grown-up witch or experienced witch would understand that jars and bottles are fragile and will probably break, and that's one hell of a weakness in your prison if you're making it out of
Yeah,
glass. So the
yeah,
stereotypical idea that you will see in films of some little kids breaking into a house and they disturb a shelf because a cat jumps up, goes meow, and they jump back, knock a bunch of bottles off of the shelf, and then a load of them fall on the floor, smash, and then spirits get released. I don't know whether that's an actual film. That's just coming to my mind, but it sounds like the sort of shit you'd get in a film, or at the very least a Goosebumps episode. Um,
yeah. Maybe more Goosebumps.
and I kind of thinking, well, obviously, whoever is the witch in that Goosebumps episode, clearly they ain't a very professional witch, because the very fact that they haven't incorporated the fact that the physical object, if it smashes, it doesn't release it from the bindings. That might be a cocked up spell. But it does remind me of the whole idea of these characters in the films and that, where they're like, there's a Ouija board and it's haunted and there's a spirit attached to it. Oh, I know, if I burn the Ouija board, that'll fix my problems. When obviously that won't be the case. So, at least not in the films that I've seen. So, in terms of the process, then, for binding a spirit, and then the process as well, because I think this is kind of like a bolt on, an additional extra. You need to download a couple of extra plugins to make this bit work, and that is the kind of idea of creating a genie. So confining the genie, because there's an idea of putting a spirit in a prison, which I think quite a lot of magical practitioners probably do. And then there's the idea of, oh, I'm going to take this spirit and I'm going to bind it and I'm going to use it as kind of like a slave and exploit it, which is kind of like the Solomonic ceremonial magician's approach. They normally bind it to a ring, I think, or stick it in a brass urn or some
Yeah,
shit
well,
like that.
it really depends on how you're approaching it.
Mm.
So if you're approaching it from an Abrahamic tradition, then obviously what you're talking about is they're in the same categories as most of the goetic spirits. So there are a series of spirits that are okay, bound by the laws of God. Does that make sense?
It
Would
makes
that be
sense
a
to
way that
me.
makes sense to people? Hence why in the film Aladdin, it can't bring people back from the dead. It can't make people fall in love with each other. And what was the other one? I can't remember what the other thing they can't do is. But that's why it falls on those traditions, is because that's actually the Abrahamic version of a genie, as opposed to the kind of Eastern Mesopotamian kind of level spirit, which has a more kind of natural feel to them. So, if you're going down the kind of um, Abrahamic point of view, then they are just a class of spirit in the same class as a goetic spirit that therefore is bound to the decisions that its original contract was built with. Um, whatever, and all you're doing is transferring it to from one prison to another temporarily.
Essentially,
Did that
any
make any sense?
any form of spirit prison is basically putting limitations and constraints on a spirit. So it's not all the same, because you've got to think of it less as I'm trapping the spirit in something, and I think more as in what I'm doing is I'm, putting a little curfew on this spirit so it can't go out late at night, or it's not allowed to do this, or it's
Yeah,
got an ASBO and ain't allowed to go in the centre of town, for example. It's constraining
yeah,
and confining the spirit. So, in terms of how you constrain and confine the spirit, that will depend on your approach, your ability from a magical perspective, and then essentially it's like this kind of idea of whether it can fight back or whether it can, whether you can actually enforce this constraint. Because obviously the vast majority of spirits that you would be dealing with in terms of this kind of thing, the useful types, they would exist outside of space-time, essentially. So if you were to bind it, you would be binding it outside of space-time, which means that it would be affecting it, technically from our perspective, back in the past and also in the future, which is quite a difficult thing to get your head around. But still, it is one of those things that when you look deep into the kind of Solomonic perspective of ceremonial magic and the ideas of constraining spirits, then the spirit's already been constrained, it's already been done, so you're then looking at exploiting that, essentially. Now, I know we don't do curriculums. However, if we did do a witchcraft magical practitioner curriculum or an apprenticeship, I would make sure that spirit prisons and that kind of sticking souls in jars and that was a definite thing as a minimum requirement to pass said curriculum, because there's a lot of different types of areas of magic that you need to learn in order to do it effectively. And in terms of seeing the repercussions of doing something like that, that's also something that's super important. So fiddling with it can have a big knock-on effect. So obviously we should probably talk about the most common, I think, reasons for why magical practitioners try and put spirits in jars and that. And I think I've noticed that obviously when people train, not naming any names, when people train and get the ability to do that and play with that sort of magic, they tend to pick it up and then run with it. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
Get carried away?
Yeah.
And start rather extensive jar collections of spirits just because they can.
Yeah.
Like my nan when she used to collect those horrible fucking clowns. Little porcelain clowns. Ugh.
Oh God, don't.
I knew a
Those
lady
freak
that
me out.
used to
I don't
collect
like them.
porcelain like china cats as well. Oh, it becomes an obsession, collecting spirits and that. It's like their go-to method. And I'm thinking that really it's kind of almost, to me, like when you've got a cat or a dog and someone's coming in your house and they're allergic to them or annoyed by, they are scared of dogs or something. You just constrain it and put it in the other room, or you put it out in the garden. Yeah. I think of it like this. I don't think of it as a permanent thing. I kind of think of it as, okay, that's going to be annoying. I can tell that it's going to be annoying, so we better put the dog in the other room. Lock the dog away before Rosemary comes round, type thing. So I kind of think constraining spirits a lot of the time as a temporary thing. Now I see that from a magical perspective, because if you were to do that, it's not going to last forever and ever and ever and ever and ever anyway. You would probably have to create your own dimension and stick it in there then, because at the end of the day, if the magic you're working is too close to this universe or exists within the universe we're currently in, when the universe ends, the magic's going to be undone. So it's temporary. Might be millions upon bajillions of years, but it's still going to be undone. Sealing things for a lifetime, I can understand. I know the magical practitioners that have sealed things away from way back in the day, and they're still kind of sealed away. I know Lady Poison tells of this folklore about a spirit or something being constrained underneath, I think it's a river or something like that, in a bridge, and if the plant growth grows up to the top of the bridge or something, then obviously it means that the spirit gets released. So the council and that, they keep cutting it down because it's kind of local legend. Whether that's true or not, I don't know if there's a spirit there. I've never been there, but it was one of her little stories that she did say about, which illustrates a very good point. And that is, if assuming that it is true, and that if the plant growth did reach the point of covering the bridge and that spirit got released, was that programmed into the spell? Or is that just this Disney Brothers Grimm idea of, well, every spell needs a kind of a loophole type thing, so I'll plan the loophole. Only by the kiss of a prince will you awaken type shit. It's like, I know I've got
Yeah,
to build a back door in this or a loophole in this, so it better be that I pick it rather than the universe picks it. Is that the kind of approach?
yeah, I think that's normally the approach people take traditionally from a kind of, well, it's definitely a Western thing. I don't think there is the same kind of approach when it comes to Eastern work. But yeah, in the West, we kind of like to, I think we like our contracts too much, and therefore there is always a get out clause, and therefore we must always plan for that. It's normally hidden in the fine print, and we are very good at hiding the fine print,
Yeah.
um, to the point that I like those ones where. Did you ever watch I think, is it the third or the fourth Shrek movie? Did you ever watch
I haven't
those?
watched any of the Shreks. I tried to watch one of them, but I
Okay.
find it annoying.
Oh, you really need to watch one. It's either the third or the fourth one. I can't remember which, but it's about Rumpelstiltskin, and he does this kind of spell contract arrangement where there is always a loophole, and the loophole normally is found by origamiing up the actual contract itself, and then reveals the answer. If you fold it in the right ways, the answer is there in a word. So
No,
like,
that's cool.
true love's kiss, or whatever it is, because it's always something like that, isn't it, if it's kind of fairy tale based. But yeah, you basically have to fold the contract itself up until it reveals the words that will give you a tip off as to how you break it. But yeah, so like, I think that is a very much a Western thing, that we like to set the breakage point if needed. But I think that's more of a security point from a practitioner's point of view. So that's kind of you setting the goal, not necessarily to make sure, but if something goes wrong, you know how to undo it, more so than necessarily that someone else needs the get out clause. Um, I quite like the physical ones. You know me, I'm more likely to um, bind a spirit to a particular piece of land or to a bloodline rather than necessarily to a bottle, or some kind of
You're
amulet
talking
or
something
something.
that's going to last a little longer, though, aren't you? Because
Yeah,
that
because that
sounds
was
more like
normally,
revenge and anger as opposed to something else.
yeah. So I'm more likely to bind something to a physical, something that won't change or will take so long to change that you're stuck there. Um, but then I do a lot of spells that I bind to living things. So,
Yeah.
I've
But then you also
had,
use binding as a punishment.
yeah, but that's not the only thing I use them for. But I quite like binding spells to living things like oak trees. Therefore, they have the option to last for hundreds of years and are self-perpetuating. So, that's the main part of reason that you would tie something to a living thing, is so that it's got the power to stay locked. Because this is what people tend to forget about, is there needs to be a power source longer term. If it's if it's a strong spirit, you're going to need the power to subdue it on a longer period of time. Whereas if you're just putting a ghosty in a bottle, it doesn't have the possibility to raise enough energy for it to break out of said Alcatraz. When you start thinking about gin and things like that have their own power source, you need to then match that and suppress the energy that it or the access point to the energy that it requires in order to do it. So if we were to go to a similar kind of spirit, say let's talk about a succubus rather than, or an incubus rather than a jinn, they're a similar class of being. They have a power source that they need to have access to. So so if you're going to starve it of being able to live on the kind of sex energy that is required to keep an incubus or a succubus happy. If you're locking it in a bottle, it can't feed. And this is what it comes down to. So with gin, in my experience, gin like the contract, or at least they are programmed to like the contract aspect. So, you get those 3 wishes and then it moves on. But that's because, from my experience, I don't have much experience with the Abrahamic ones, shall we say, that are bound to those kind of contracts. Whereas the kind of slightly more traditional kind of gin from the Middle East, they're less contract based and are more like the trickster spirits of old. So, these kind of mercurial kind of spirits that people often talk about.
Am I right in thinking it was the Tempest with William Shakespeare that had Prospero
Yeah,
binding a spirit? So that's the
yeah,
idea of the sorcerer, looking at the old kind of classical witchcraft, classical magic now, binding spirits to do their bidding is very, very close to the genie thing. The difference with the genie thing is, well, I don't know if it is a difference to the genie thing, because I can't remember with the whole Aladdin thing about how he finds the lamp. Does he steal it, or does he find it, or what?
depends which version. If you go the
Right.
Disney version, he has to steal it technically, because it's in the Cave of Wonders. But the
Uh,
but in that situation, he's stealing it for somebody else. Is the plan, but it backfires. But the in other versions of it, it's I think it's always a theft. I think it's mentioned in the Alibaba um, stories as well, but um, don't quote me on that. But the yeah, there's a part and parcel of it will find you, or you will find it, is part of the folklore, if that makes sense. It's not always theft.
because the perspective I'm trying to get at is obviously Aladdin didn't make the genie in the bottle, did he? So essentially,
No,
someone
discovered it.
has put a genie in the bottle, probably for their own use. It's probably one of these short-term spells where they say, I'll put this genie and confine it to the bottle. It'll give me 3 wishes. I'll do what I want with it. And then they're like, oh yeah, that I remember that old project. I'll put it in the kind of side room. Side room being the Cave of Wonder. And then it ends up
Yeah,
getting lost. Much like I've done spells and put them in the cupboard because they've been all used up and done, but I forget to throw them away or dismantle them, so I end up putting them in a storeroom somewhere.
yeah,
So it's kind of like that in the form of, oh, well, this is designed to give me access to this genie type spirit. I've done my bit with it. I'm just going to put it into storage now, and then someone else comes along and uses the magic. So from
yeah,
that perspective, that's the point, I think, is the using the spirit, using the binding in that as a way of forcing the spirit to do your bidding, kind of like Siri in the old iPhone. Essentially, what it is, it's just a
yeah,
slave, and then Siri will do whatever Siri's told by anyone that owns the iPhone.
yeah,
Whereas when you're talking about prisons, you're talking about sticking a spirit so that no one can, it can't mess with you, essentially. So if you're talking about certain magical practitioners and magicians that think certain spirits are troublesome to humankind, they might take it upon themselves to stop said spirits from interfering with this physical reality. That's big magic. That's big boy and big girl magic, because that takes some doing. And then there's the idea, of course, where you're just really binding a spirit. You're kind of saying you're essentially enslaving it. That's what it is magical enslavement, isn't it? This
yeah.
old genie thing. So, would you be able to take the same approach, do you think, with every spirit if you wanted to put whatever spirit it was in some kind of prison, would you be able to do it with any spirit? Obviously, you can answer that on the Thoth Witchcraft Patreon, because we're out of time now for the regular listeners. Should join the Patreon, people.